So today I want to talk about being too poor to work. And I mean that quite literally, being too poor to find and maintain a job or employment. In the United States, and I'm sure in a lot of other parts of the world, there is this mistaken belief that if you just hand people a job, if you give them employment, that they will somehow use that money that they get from their job to lift themselves up and achieve the American dream. That somehow they'll reach a place of financial security and stability and they'll have personal liberty with their money. This myth could not be more wrong, nor in further contrast from the way most Americans live. Most Americans are in a situation where they are one or two paychecks away from being in a really bad spot. People are living paycheck to paycheck and cannot handle an emergency. And a loss of a job could mean the end of their stability and their ability to maintain a home, a family, and any other number of things that they'd like to consider part of their daily lives. And so, if you are someone in this type of place who has lost their job, you are quite aware of some of the difficulties and decisions that one might have to make at navigating the space to try to find employment. And this is, again, a rough situation across the board. So, I want to talk about this also, not just because it's something that is really important to discuss, but I wanted to discuss this issue because I had a lot of trouble finding articles and resources to use in this video. And I think it's really important. So I'm going to try to drive the narrative myself. And if you're able to find any information or articles that maybe I missed, please feel free to comment below and let me know what they are, because I'd like to see other people who have talked about this and what their perspectives are. And furthermore, a lot of these issues are cyclical. So just because you have, I start at one point in this doesn't mean that may be the point that another person is going to start at with this in terms of what need they're examining. And a lot of these issues compound each other and move across the board. So even if I address one point as my start point, know that this could really start anywhere in this particular cycle and experience. So if you're someone who is in a place trying to find employment, one of the first barriers that you might come across is trying to get to your place of employment. In a lot of places, such as New York City, for example, it can cost up to $127 a month to have a bus pass, a Metro card, in order to get from place to place. So you can find yourself in a situation where you might not be able to afford the public transit or to afford the car you need to get from place to place. We have to acknowledge that some places don't have good public transit systems or public transit systems as systems at all. And even within a system like this, bus systems can be unreliable, can often be late and get people late to interviews or jobs, and can provide a situation where they are often too expensive for the person to use. And that makes for a really rough situation if you need to get to an employer or potential employer. So if you've run into that situation, that's your first issue that you're going to have to overcome, getting the finances to even afford a bus pass. Then let us say that you're trying to get a job and you get to an interview or you get to a place and you just want to get an application. Well, one of two things might happen. You might be told, okay, here's your application, now go fill it out. But more than likely in this day and age of the internet, you're going to be told you have to look it up online. So you're then required to either take a bus or your car, which may not be in great shape, and run it to the local library. But wait, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so libraries may not be open. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative is you probably should have a cheap cell phone, because even if you do get employment, you're probably going to be required to have a basic smartphone in order to be able to check your schedule, be able to check any information your boss might send you outside of that schedule for extra hours that might be the difference between you eating and paying rent that month, or you might need access to some sort of way to communicate with other people in your job. So a phone, probably a good idea to have. So now you need to get access to a cell phone. And there's all sorts of barriers to achieve that, which I think are similar, but to go through that process would be a lot. But let's say you manage to get your hands on a prepaid phone that allows you to just have enough data and minutes to basically maintain what you need to look up applications. So now you've paid that cost. Now you've paid the bus passes, and you can now try to get your application submitted. The first thing you come across on your application, or one of the first things after your name, is where do you live? What if you're homeless? What if you're someone who's in a situation where your home address maybe isn't safe for you to receive mail or to get other information? Now you're in a catch-22 because now you want to fill out the application, but maybe the application won't submit if you don't put an address in. And you can't go back to the place of employment to tell them that because a lot of times they're not going to hire you if you're homeless. So do you make up an address? What is your end goal and result there? Well, you need to get an apartment, and we already know how expensive those are. If you've watched any of my stimulus check videos, you know that some of the cheapest rents in the United States right now for studio apartments range around $600. And if you're at the place where you can't afford a bus pass and you're struggling to pay your, for that cell phone you need for employment, that rent is probably out of reach, even if you take on roommates. So you're now in a place where you are struggling to fill out the application because of this. Let's say you somehow manage to get past that hurdle. You might now have a situation where you're called in for an interview to be talking about that situation. Well, now you're going to need to deal with dress code. You have to be able to dress for your interview. And in a lot of situations, that requires you to buy clothes or have very fresh, clean clothes. Now, some people might be fortunate enough to be in a place where they can go to a place like Goodwill or some sort of discount store where you can get clothes for cheap. Not everyone has access to that, unfortunately. And so that might add another hurdle and cost to you even getting an interview, let alone a job. And so we have this situation across the board where you're having to pay these little fees here and there to try to even get your foot into an interview, let alone a job itself. Now, if you are someone who's identified in this society as a woman, you might have a number of more costs added to what you need to maintain employment. Some things that I think men and people who are identifying as men may not think about. The need for cosmetics. A lot of jobs will not hire a woman who's not wearing makeup, will not hire a woman who doesn't wear heels, or will require it as part of a uniform. So things like that and gender-specific dress components can change factors immensely. I'll also point this out. A lot of men's clothes can often be more expensive than women's clothes, though women are expected to have a much wider wardrobe available than what men will have. Men can typically wear the same few outfits over and over again. Women, not so much. But let's say we're dealing with a job that already has a uniform. Now, you filled out the application. Let's say you're trying to work for a McDonald's, because I know McDonald's is actually a place that gives people, I think, their first uniform, or maybe they make you pay for that. I'm not sure. But if they pay for it, that's another barrier. If they do give you your first uniform, then at least you have that. So you've gotten this uniform. But if you're someone who's homeless and has been struggling up to this point, how are you supposed to clean that uniform between shifts by the time you get until you get your first paycheck? How are you supposed to reach that point where you can then pay for it to be clean? So even if you did manage to get this job and you did manage to deal with all the dress code requirements and you got past it and the manager hired you, now you're in a place where you can't clean your uniform, and when you show up to work, you're going to get a reprimand against you, which might lead to you losing your job. So you're just in this really rough place all across the board. And there are other issues that we could talk about. We could talk about the fact that most places pay with a bank account now. You need a bank account in order to do this, and bank accounts require all sorts of restrictions to getting a bank account itself, including having to have startup money. you might run into a situation where, even if your place is willing to pay you via check, you might have to get that put into a cash checking place, which can charge 2 to 3% off of your check every single time as a fee. And so, consistently, across the board, you as a person who's in poverty trying to find work are getting cut at and cut at and cut at and cut at. And for someone who maybe is more well off, maybe these little $20 expenses here, $100 expenses there may not seem like the biggest deal if you have savings and you've been in a place like that. But that's not something that someone who maybe has $100 to their name can really deal with moving forward. Someone who maybe can't afford their own rent right now can afford moving forward. And if you do have employment and you're trying to seek a better situation, you might even run into a situation where you can't take off time from one job to try to find another that might pay you more. Like, it's across the board a problem to try to find employment. And that isn't even factoring in things like childcare, where in a place like New York City, on average, it can cost you $16,000 a year for an infant to be in childcare. So if you were in a place where you might have been financially secure at one point and you had a kid, or maybe you just had a kid, because sometimes that happens. And as I've covered before on this channel, abortion access isn't always available to people. So if you end up in that place where you have a kid, now you might have to pay for their childcare. And 16 grand a year, oh, have fun paying that on minimum wage. That isn't going to happen. And of course, that may not be as expensive in some other places. You might be able to rely on a church or a communal daycare or something like that. But even still, those cost money. And those are barriers to entry for a lot of people. And oftentimes, I'm going to be real, childcare falls on women, especially single mothers. And so, some other nuanced things I just want to talk about is that within the United States, it's been found that a third of families who receive supplemental nutrition assistance programs benefits had 2 or more people working. So even if you get into a place of employment, you still might be in a place where you're too poor to pay for your basic necessities and be relying on the government for it. A lot of Walmart employees, in fact, are handed food stamp applications after they get their job. And furthermore, it's been shown that based on Career Builder's numbers, one of the few places I was able to find, that 81% of workers said that they did not incur any costs the last time they looked for a new job, but those who did incur costs, and I guarantee you those people are mostly in overwhelming situations of poverty, 27% had said that they needed to spend $200 or more to purchase items including clothing, transportation, printing, and travel. And that's the other thing that I didn't even address. If you're someone who's poor and in a rough spot, you might have faced other barriers to entry, not just including the financial. That could be included on this list: age, criminal record, disability, disadvantaged background, domestic violence, drug or alcohol abuse, education, employer biases, having a child with special needs or a child in general, housing issues or homelessness, job search skills, lacking basic what's considered employable skills, limited English proficiency, long-term welfare recipients might face barriers, mental illness, the need for training that employers don't want to pay for, needing childcare assistance, which we've addressed, no high school diploma, no transportation, and gaps in employment. When you're trying to set up a resume or some sort of documentation about your employment history or anything like that, not having a GED or a high school diploma, having gaps in your employment, having any sort of, medical leave or anything like that might be counted against you. If you're someone who got evicted, chances are someone's not going to want to employ you based on biases. If you've been homeless, biases might work against you. If you are, in a household that has domestic violence, which of course affects people with poverty a lot more than people who are not in poverty situations, that's going to be an issue. And down the list, you could tie each one of these to a poverty situation, either being the main culprit or exacerbating the problem. So really what it comes down to is employers have an issue with the way they're handling things, but also in general, jobs are not the solution we need to be looking for going forward. Furthermore, if you're a felon and you get out of prison, and of course you're going to be poor probably coming out of prison, you are not in a place where you can get a job sometimes because felons are restricted in and are not a protected class in terms of employment. Jobs can and will discriminate against you. So at the end of the day, if you're in one of these situations, you might actually find yourself in a place where you can't afford the $200, even in a minimum scenario, to find a way into employment. And once you are there, the costs are very high. As Career Builder has shown, in addition to what it costs to get the job, you might be paying another $276 a month on average to maintain your job. That's $3,300 a year. And if you're someone trying to find a place to live, pay rent, pay for your food, pay for your other necessities, that's not going to get you out of poverty. Not at $7.25 an hour, certainly. So at the end of the day, people can actually be in a place where they are too poor to work, too poor to find and maintain a job and or employment. And that is absolutely atrocious in what's known as the richest country in the world. We need to figure out ways to do better. We need to start looking at methods like a UBI, universal health care, definitely Medicare for all, because that isn't even covering the factor of sickness that people might experience if they're in poverty, and the fact that poor people tend to have more medical problems and need that care more than anyone else. We need to start looking at this as a society and not basing it just on who's working hard enough and who's doing enough. There aren't enough jobs out there. There isn't enough respect and care out there. And in general, employment doesn't even seem to solve the problems, if you can even find a job in the first place. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.